Well, it seems like you guys really liked the new alternate history style. So, here comes part 2 of the what if Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators succeeded in blowing up the Houses of Parliament. Let's get right into the good stuff, that being Britain's involvement in the 30 Years' War. I don't think Britain gets involved. Now, I know some people were probably hoping for some crazy differences in this timeline, but I'm trying to keep it somewhat realistic. Given that Britain is likely either going through a period of religious consolidation or a civil war, getting involved in one of the largest wars to ever grace the European continent, at least up until this time period, seems to be almost impossible. But ultimately, this means that Britain comes out of the 17th century with a stronger economy and base of manpower. In the 18th century, Britain's relationship with its North American colonies would become strained, as it did in our timeline, except the American Revolution probably happens earlier. As a new absolutist Protestant monarchy, the core values of the British government in this new timeline would come into conflict with the ethos of liberty prevalent across the town hall parliaments that one would find in America at the time. America would launch their War of Independence probably a few decades before it happened in our timeline, and it would succeed, mostly down to the same factors that hampered the English in our timeline. So these are things like a lack of available manpower on the American continent for the British, being so far from the British Isles, and also a lack of local knowledge of things like geography. And of course, another large problem was that the French got involved in the war. And I think that that would still happen given that Britain had become a hardline Protestant monarchy and France was still very Catholic. And yet, France and Britain do still have that friendly rivalry, so that would also play a part in this. But this has deeper consequences than you might think. It changes the structure of the USA. There is no George Washington to elect as president, and many of the founding fathers that we know of may have even been too young, or not born yet, in this timeline. The success of the American Republic, at least in our timeline, was based on a set of incredibly dynamic and intelligent individuals, as well as certain historical events going the way that they did. It is possible that America still succeeds as a unified republic, but more likely than not, the Union falls apart. Most likely the states form into independent entities, connected by some kind of a loose trading network. As Britain was such a large trading partner for these states, I feel like the relationship between them and Britain becomes more like that which one could classify as, well, something we saw in the later British Empire called the informal empire, where nominally the states would be independent, but Britain's trade influence and the money that it invested into these areas probably make them similar to a trade protectorate. And as a result of this, we might not see the 7 Years' War, or at least the 7 Years' War being as prevalent on the North American continent. Spain would continue to expand northward into California and west of the Mississippi, and perhaps even some of the American states in the south would fall under Spanish influence more than that of the British. And so this would become a new front, where Spain and Britain could have a proxy conflict, where they each supported different American states. And over time we probably see the different states forming into slightly larger national identities. For example, a nation based around New England, which would likely be under British influence in the north, and one based around the American South, which would be more likely to be influenced by the Spanish. The other big influence that this has on the world is that the French Revolution happens earlier. The revolutionary ideas of the attempted American Republic would still be ripe in the minds of the people of France, who were experiencing financial difficulty following their funding of America during the Revolutionary War. I think that the French monarchy, being as absolutist as it was, would probably be overthrown, and due to the failures that we saw in the French Revolution in our timeline, France would still be likely to fall into a military dictatorship. However, as this event happens much earlier than it does in our timeline, we don't see Napoleon rising to become the emperor. Instead, it's more likely to be a less competent general or a collection of military generals governing the country. Regardless, the fighting capabilities of France are drastically reduced in the absence of such an amazing leader as Napoleon. So the French monarchy is likely to be restored a lot quicker than it was in our timeline, and I think it probably wouldn't get overthrown for a second time, given that the population in France would be in for an even crapper revolutionary period than they had in our timeline, since their military would perform a lot worse than it did, in our timeline at least. So as we get into the early 19th century, we see absolutist monarchies in Britain, France, Scandinavia, Spain and Russia, and the revolutionary ideas of our timeline would be much less effective, given that the governmental system that had won in Europe was that of absolutism. As a result, the democracies that rose in the 20th century either don't rise or occur at a later stage. And this stifles Europe's later dominance that we see in our timeline, given that there would be a lack of strong mercantile economies. Instead, command economies would be the most popular form of economy, since absolutist monarchies would want to control every aspect of their countries. At this point, there's not much more to predict. It becomes very difficult to somewhat rationally work out what the various players around the world would do. But still, I think it was fun to think about, well, the new world that would have come from such a small change. And yeah, if you liked it, drop the video a cheeky like, subscribe to stay up to date with content, and I'll see you next time.